Is it your assessment, is it NATO's assessment that Vladimir Putin is not considering ending his invasion of Ukraine?
Well, we don't know, but I think this is the test now. And we have to see
What happens if he's
what his
not?
reaction
Do you
will
know
be to the American proposals.
Right, what's the consequence? Do you know?
So it's difficult for me to assess, but clearly we have to take this step by step. And until January this year, nothing happened when it came to bringing this war to an end. When Trump came in, President Trump came in, after his inauguration, he started this process. And it might take longer than we would want to, but the fact that he tries is therefore also testing the Russians, whether they are serious in this. We have to see over the coming weeks how far he can get it. And I'm supporting it.
I understand that. General Cavoli, who you know well as the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, the U.S. general is here in Washington testifying this week. He said Russia intends to diminish U.S. leadership and influence. It is actively conducting a destabilization campaign within Europe right now to create strategic dilemmas for the U.S. What is happening to NATO members here? And is Russia succeeding in this destabilization campaign?
Chris Cavoli is the Supreme Allied Commander. He is absolutely right. What we are seeing in Europe, but also in the US, but let me speak for the European side of NATO, is that the Russians, through cyber attacks, assassination attempts, jamming commercial airplanes in the Baltic area, cyber attacks on the National Health Service in the United Kingdom, cutting critical undersea infrastructure between Baltic countries and Finland, and in other parts of the Baltic Sea. They're conducting this campaign. The good news is that as NATO, as collective, we are much, much better, not only at assessing what is happening, but also making sure that we prevent the next steps in this campaign from happening. And the Russians hate us for that, and we have to do this. So Cavoli is completely right here.
So that destabilization campaign has not halted or paused as these attempts to broker peace have been underway?
I mean, this whole destabilization campaign is going on for years now.
Yeah.
And I have no day-to-day assessment whether it is on a scale from 1 to 10 at number 9 or number 3. But the reports we are getting is that the Russians are still very active. We are still worried about, for example, the critical undersea infrastructure. But thanks to Chris Cavoli and in his role as Supreme Allied Commander, we have in less than 10 days brought together a big endeavor by European NATO allies in the Baltic Sea to really make it very difficult for the Russians to continue doing this. And again, they hate us for this, and I love that.
That was NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte talking about the NATO and its role in the Russian ceasefire, how much he's supporting the U.S. efforts in that regard, and, of course, putting it on Russia at this point in time. As you may recall, Ukraine and the U.S. has already put a full ceasefire on the table. Russia's effectively rejected that at this point in time. There was an energy infrastructure ceasefire, supposed to be an energy and infrastructure ceasefire, but the Russians said, oh, no, you said energy infrastructure ceasefire, and so therefore we're not ceasefiring on the rest of infrastructure, etc. And there's also the Baltic Sea ceasefire that was reported as well. Well, we'll talk about a lot of those things tonight. Thank you very much for joining me. Glad to have you here. We have got a lot of things to cover real quick. As you know, it's been a little bit since I have been on, doing a live stream on this. Over the last 2 weeks, I've driven over 2,500 miles. Been very, very busy, and just happy to kind of generally be back and into the familiar chair here. Got my seat in the right seat. So glad to be back, and we got a lot to talk about today. Now, President Trump did make a comment about the situation in Ukraine in his typical style here. So let's go ahead and get that brought up here and listen to what he has to say.
Making progress in terms of peace. We're talking to Russia. We'd like them to stop. I don't like the bombing. The bombing goes on and on, and Every week, thousands of young people are being killed. And it's a horrible thing that should have never started, would have never started if I were president, 100%.
This is on top of everything else that's gone on between Trump and Zelensky and everything else about the war in Ukraine. So it's looking like Trump may finally be calling out the Russian president for effectively just leading him on. Will this actually result in more action in this regard? We have at this point no way of knowing, but there's some interesting things that have popped up. In fact, I had something that just popped up. Let me go ahead and grab it real quick and we'll talk about it right now. And share, send it to devices and kind of taking this one by the seat of the old pants. By the way, good to see you both, Lucille and Jerry. Always glad to have you guys on board. I appreciate you guys being here. So let's go ahead and listen to Scott Bessent, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, talking about Zelensky to Tucker Carlson. Now, as you know, my opinion of Tucker Carlson has not been particularly high for some time, but interesting. He is still an active individual that has the president's ear at different points in time. So let's go ahead and hear what Scott Bessent has to say here.
Couple of things is he was a performer, kind of a vaudevillian, and he was an ordinary person thrown into a fraught time, rose to the occasion, was heroic, and I think is stuck. And I think under a tremendous amount of pressure, I think that some of the government officials around him and the cabinet are very good. I think some of the people around him, he's not getting the best advice, that his advisors are not perfect.
So that's an interesting set of statements from Secretary Bessent on Zelensky. And to be honest, I can see exactly how I can actually see his point. President Zelensky ended up having to rise up to an absolutely mortifying occasion in his country. He had to step up and be the leader that his people needed, even if it wasn't the leader he was. And while there's certainly plenty of room to criticize, I'm not going to take that opportunity at this point in time. But there's plenty of room to criticize President Zelensky. I don't think you can criticize him for his patriotism or his desire to do what is right for his people. But the fact is that Bessent said this to Tucker Carlson, who nodded approvingly at the statement that Zelensky is heroic. Carlson has absolutely ripped into Zelensky in the past. The fact that he allowed this to even be said on his program is shocking in and of itself. This could be, as J.P. Lindsley states here, this is an olive branch from Washington. It's a moment to mend relations. And this could be the first real opportunity to mend that relationship again and actually be able to move forward in the future. I don't know. The volatility of the U.S. government at this point in time is so unpredictable that I am certainly not going to go on record with any kind of prediction as to how Trump or his administration is going to respond to this statement, to this opportunity, and whether Zelensky has the ability or the opportunity to respond in a positive way. We'll just have to see. Now, before I jump into the main part of the news, I'm going to talk about the biggest news that happened over the weekend in the U.S., and that is tariffs imposed upon nearly every nation in the world. By the way, Robbie, glad to have you here. I haven't seen Paul or Ozzy just yet, but glad to have you as well. So let's go ahead and roll on in here. Tariffs. The situation with tariffs, and just disclaimer here, I am not a financial expert. I have done some research on this based on some other opinions and looked into some of the history of tariffs to just kind of be able to talk intelligently about this at this point in time. But let's go ahead and talk about this for a bit. On late last week, President Trump announced tariffs on effectively nearly everybody in the entire world. Now, the new set of tariffs excluded Russia, North Korea, and Iran. But effectively, everybody in the world got a flat line, at least 10% tariff that on items that they're being imported into the U.S. And then based on the trade imbalance, because this is not about the tariffs that they're levying on products that we export to their countries, but based on the trade imbalance, a larger figure was then assessed against based on where the products are coming from. Tariffs, just so we're clear, are not a tax on the other nation. Well, they are a tax on the people of the U.S. When we implement them, they're a tax on the people of the U.S. because products we bring in from those other countries become more expensive. This is a protectionist measure. It's supposed to, in most cases, make it so that a domestic industry can compete against cheaper foreign goods. However, by and large, protectionism doesn't work, especially when you're the big guy. So I'm not going to go into a whole lot of that. Just understand that these tariff figures have been implemented almost across the board, including the Heard and McDonald Islands in the South China Sea, which has a population of a few thousand penguins. There are no human beings there. So overall, it's there's a lot of things to be said about this. I'm going to try and spin through this as quick as I can because, again, the key here is that the tariffs were announced. The stock markets reacted tremendously badly. We've had tremendous sell-offs over the weekend and today. There was even a bump today when there was a rumor. And I think I've got this in here today. There was even a bump this morning when there was a rumor that the tariffs would be delayed for 90 days. And then when the administration denied that there was any talks about a 90-day delay, the markets immediately tumbled again. That is how volatile the markets are right now. We are looking at, in fact, the numbers are looking into recession territory significantly from everything I've been able to research. So this by itself wouldn't be a big deal because a lot of people are saying, well, it's a negotiating tactic. We're trying to bring people to the table so that we can negotiate a better deal. Negotiate to where they don't put tariffs on our goods and we don't put tariffs on their goods. There's a lot of things that indicate that's not the case because, for instance, there's on the tariffs against Europe, Donald Trump immediately said, yes, we've got these tariffs here. They're coming to negotiate, but unless we're getting a whole lot of money from Europe, we're not going to reduce our tariffs. So basically it's a shakedown in some ways. Anyway, the big one though is there's a couple of big ones here. China did not come to negotiate. They said, okay, we're going to just tariff anything that the U.S. exports to us. It's retaliatory tariffs. So they bumped it up, and one of the biggest things that came out over the weekend was don't put on retaliatory tariffs. We, the U.S., can hit you, but you can't hit us back because that'll just cause problems for everybody. Well, there's a lot of problems for everybody. Effectively, the president managed to put brakes on the world economy with the stroke of a pen through this tariff action. Now, this could only be done by declaring it effectively an emergency, an emergency economic situation effectively that would allow the president to enact tariffs. That the responsibility for tariffs should be with the legislature. But that's a lot of water under the drawbridge I'm not going to go into in detail. But China is the one that said, okay, we'll play your game. Let's do this. Because the last time we had a trade war, it did not necessarily go very well, and a lot of farmers bumped into some problems. There have been demonstrations across the United States that have been in response, not necessarily to the tariffs, but a lot of it is in relationship to to Doge, which is the Elon Musk's headed way of going through the government looking for waste, fraud, and abuse. There's some of this is just plain protests against Donald Trump himself. A lot of things going on this. But of course, the Russians immediately said this is a color revolution that the deep state is carrying out against the United States. They love their color revolutions. In fact, they love to talk about how much the West creates these color revolutions, because it certainly couldn't be those countries throwing off the yoke of oppression that has been put upon them. The one benefit to these tariffs, though, is that prices for oil fell off a cliff. The last numbers I had was about $60 for Western or Brent crude per barrel. Russian oil fell to $50 per barrel. If it hits $44 per barrel, Russia literally cannot make money pulling the oil out of the ground. Just can't do it. It will cost them more money to pump the oil than it will be than they can actually get to put it onto the market. So with the price of oil falling like a rock, this is the first real dent we've had in Russia's ability to raise money for their war efforts. So even though this was not targeted at Russia at all, as I said, Russia was actually not on the list of those that these sanctions were added to. This has resulted in a real gut punch for the Russian economy. The Russians initially were like, when they first started talking about the tariffs, were like, the West is creating a global recession. It's going to cause all kinds of problems for America, and it is, just so we're clear. But the propaganda started realizing that oil was so badly affected that oh, by the way, Luciano, glad to have you on board as well. Yeah, you're on the right track there, Luciano. Anyway, so the Russian propagandists were like, wait a second, whoa, hold on a second. Oil is dropping as well. And then their statements started coming out. It's hard to see a floor for crude unless the panic in the markets subsides, and it's hard to see that happening unless Trump says something to arrest snowballing fears over a global trade war and recession. One of the biggest things that people elected Trump to do was to have a reassuring presence in the White House, that there was somebody who had his wits about him and would be able to carry out the policy of the nation. This is definitely not this action has created such tremendous shocks to the system that people have no feeling of security. They're scared. They truly are scared across the board. Now, about the tariffs not being imposed against Russia, Trump's economic advisor stated that this was because we're currently in talks with Russia about a peace deal in Ukraine. And so they didn't want to introduce new issues into these negotiations midstream. Take your pick on how you feel about that. Then there was, of course, the fake news, and I'm going to state it that way, that the Trump administration was going to put a 90-day pause on tariffs. For a half hour, the stock markets soared from their crash, and then immediately crashed again when the U.S. said, no, that's not the case at all. That timeline is literally right here. $4 trillion moved through the market in just a short period of time, an hour or so. Kevin Hassett gave an interview at 8:24 a.m. It was clipped by a person and then misinterpreted by another person who tweeted that the White House was considering this 90-day pause. The markets popped up 7 to 10% and then fell again when the White House denied. That's how volatile the financial markets are right now. Overall, the Dow Jones was down as of 9:49 a.m. today, another 2%, down 19% since February. And as noted here, this is in the same ballpark as the 1929 and 1987 crashes. Originally, the Russian newspapers were like, hey, fallout from these tariffs. Trump has rejuvenated the Russian economy. And yet it didn't take long for, again, those oil prices to start dropping and the Russians start going, oh, this is going to hurt. At this point, Russia may not even be able to meet their budget for the year. And if it falls any further, they may be irreparably harmed and unable to recover. However, Elon Musk, who has been a big force in the Trump administration, and as I understand it, I'm kind of a little shaky on this, is stepping away from the Trump administration to go back to running Tesla and SpaceX for a while. He basically said, no, it would be really nice right about now, a tariff-free zone between the U.S. and the European Union. This will allow for free movement of the workforces and tariff-free trade. And this would make it more possible because understand Tesla and SpaceX have both been they've been definitely suffering in the stock prices in recent days. In the end, though, this just comes down to economic illiteracy. President Trump said that basically said that since the tariffs were announced, that other world leaders have been coming to him to cut a deal. And he's saying, we're not going to have trade deficits with your country. We're not going to do that because to me, a deficit is a loss. We're going to have surpluses, or at worst, we're going to be breaking even. And the thing is that this is kind of like, I have a trade deficit with Walmart. I go to Walmart and I buy things from Walmart, and they take my money, and I have therefore a trade deficit with Walmart. Except for the thing is that I gave Walmart money in exchange for products. Walmart's not going to buy anything from me because I have nothing Walmart wants. If I want Walmart to buy something from me, I better start a company and start selling something that Walmart would want to sell. But in the meantime, Walmart and I have a tremendous trade deficit. I pay money to Walmart. Walmart doesn't pay any money to me. But I receive goods for those dollars. And in the same way, what's going on in the real world is that we bring in raw or lesser products. And what we export to the world is refined goods of very high quality and specific needs or knowledge and technical skills. So we are bringing in low margin resources and turning them around by adding value and selling them to the rest of the world. Now, the trade imbalance will exist because, I don't know the exact countries right now, but Canada can only sell us so much steel. And we can only sell Canada so many finished goods from that steel. So there's going to be an imbalance there. But this idea that trade is a zero-sum game ignores the fact that trade produces wealth, increases wealth. Instead of having one pie, trade creates two. Trade creates three. Otherwise, you're looking at a zero-sum game, and therefore there's going to be a winner and there's going to be a loser. If I import, flour, eggs, and fruit, and export pies, there's going to be a trade imbalance. For one thing, I'm going to eat some of those pies, so I can only sell so many. But you can't look at that as a trade imbalance when I'm buying $1,000 worth of flour from your country and only selling you $50 worth of pies because I'm selling my pies to the rest of the world. So that's where we're kind of at. It's a zero-sum game thought process. It is so bad that the Chinese are quoting and posting Reagan's speeches against tariffs to support their position in the trade war. That's how bad it is. So, have fun with that one. It's pretty sad when our enemies can use Ronald Reagan against us in that regard, but we'll just have to see how things shake out in the end. It's had some interesting side effects against Russia. We'll have to see if it pans out in the long run. Now let's talk about this supposed ceasefire for a moment or two. There has a massive strike. In fact, there's been massive strikes across Ukraine for the last several weeks. This one is particularly noteworthy because it was a strike against Krivyi, which is Zelensky's hometown. And the Russians claim that they were striking military targets. Let's just say they were not, and I'll have some proof of that in a bit here. This created a lot of civilian deaths and no military deaths right in the middle of Krivyi. So Ukraine immediately initiated a meeting with the UN Security Council and a special meeting with the OSCE Permanent Council after this strike. Here is video footage from inside the restaurant that Russia claimed there was Ukrainian military forces in this restaurant. This video shows you exactly what happened. You see no military members. You see civilians. You see the explosions. This is what Russia claims is a military target. A security guard shared his experience. Shared of surviving yet another missile attack in Kyiv this time. And he's finding himself at the epicenter, that there are these missile attacks are striking no military targets. There are no military targets anywhere nearby. And Russia even struck the playground in Krivyi, which killed 9 children. And Peskov stated that Russia strikes exclusively military targets. I didn't know a 9-year-old was considered a military target by Russia. I didn't know kids in a playground were such a threat to the Russian nation that they would stoop so low and be so vile as to attack kids at play. But this is Russia. For 3 weeks, Ukraine has been trying to adhere to this ceasefire that Russia has entirely ignored, striking infrastructure, civilians, everything. The U.S. spiritual advisor, Pastor Mark Burns, visited the site of this strike in Krivyi, which killed 20 people, including 9 children, and injured 74. And he condemned Russia's brutality and called on the world to stand with Ukraine. Macron from France also spoke about this, condemning the attack and called for an immediate end to the hostilities, and said, critically, that Russian airstrikes mock and undermine calls for peace talks. The UN issued one of their famous statements. Nothing like a few words on paper. The UN condemned Russia's Krivyi attack and called for an investigation. The use of an explosive weapon with wide area effects by the Russian Federation in a densely populated area and without any apparent military presence demonstrates a reckless disregard for civilian life. Robbie states here, unfortunately, Russia used several drones to level the elementary school my mother-in-law works at in Stary Saltiv. It had been rebuilt last year. You're telling me there's military targets in the elementary school? What, are they afraid that they're going to be educated? Know something? I guess educated people make poor peasants. Speaking of that, I don't have the article linked here, but Marco Rubio just a few days ago, in fact, it was shortly before this attack, stated that we would see if Russia was serious about a ceasefire in a few weeks. And at the time, he was condemning further attacks that Russians were carrying out. The Black Sea, by the way, the one that Ukraine has managed to entirely wrest from Russian control, the Russians have begun launching cruise missiles from there again. This is despite the supposed Black Sea ceasefire. Moving on to news out of Ukraine, or at least directly related to Ukraine itself. In 2021, a Ukrainian teacher by the name of Natalia Shalo went to Russian-occupied Ukrainian Horlivka to visit her sick mother. The Russians accused her of spying and detained her. She served time in Russian prison. Hard to visit your relatives, isn't it? Ukraine, for its part, is ramping up drone production across the board, from Mavics, or small drones, to long-range drones, to ground robotic systems. And now the big news out of drone production lately has been fiber optic controlled drones. The Russians have been making the most of that. By the way, the Ukrainians attempted to attack the only factory that produced fiber optic cable in Russia. The drone impacted the building but did not explode. But Ukraine is now producing 20 models of fiber optic controlled drones. Fiber optic drones cannot be, at least at this point in time, jammed or disrupted like wireless controlled ones. This does, however, have its own downsides in limiting range and capabilities. So there's a lot of escalation in warfare going on as each side comes up with a new attack. And then there's a counter to the attack. There's a counter to the counter. Then there's a new way of doing the attack. And then a new attack that will have a new counter. This is the escalation of war. Every night, hundreds of Russian drones and missiles target civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, far away from any combat zone. The amount of aerial vehicles and missiles even increased since the Trump administration has started talking to Putin. This is not a bug, but a Russian feature. Whenever you start talking to the Russian regime, then it considers this weakness, which needs to be exploited. Putin considers Trump to be weak and exemplifies this every night and day. Still, the business of Ukraine must go on. Zelensky approved appointments of new ambassadors on on April 7th. This is you've got to keep things moving. This is the administration. There's a new Ukrainian-made ground robot for use, the Ukrainian-made D-2112R. Cute little guy, little machine gun mounted on top. A lot of these little ground-based systems are replacing squads of soldiers they're able to be deployed into the battlefield and take out targets that without having to directly have soldiers in harm's way. Over in Kherson, a mother and her boy, a pregnant woman and her son, were trapped under rubble after a Russian shell hit a house. Apparently it was an evil military house. They were recovered and were put in the hospital with injuries. This is what it's like when Russia comes a-calling. Moving to the news out of Russia. And by the way, as I do this, I want to thank all of you for coming on board tonight. It's been a while since I've done a full live stream, and having you here really helps out. So I want you to know how much I appreciate you. We're here for the Ukraine. We want this war to end. We want it to end in a positive, sustainable, just way. We'll have to see how it goes. The Russians, for their part, though, say that the Americans have surrendered, capitulated, chickened out. And that's because they gathered people and organized rallies with those. You remember, you've probably seen them before. The people who build cars with a fake missile not build the cars, but they put fake missiles on top of their cars that say Washington D.C. on them, like they're going to launch missiles at Washington. Al, glad to have you here as well. Always, thank you very much. Always glad to have you here as well. No need to apologize. But the Russians are saying basically that the Americans are surrendering. They're capitulating. They're no longer the power that they once were. That said, the Russians are getting new cavalry. Their new war horses look an awful lot like donkeys. But this is because the Russians have trouble supplying their forces at the front lines. They can't get a vehicle, in many cases, within 10 kilometers of the front lines. And they're having to resupply in whatever ways they can. From the European Commission, Russia shows total disregard for peace talks with the U.S. With daily attacks killing civilians, including children, Moscow proves it has no interests in negotiations, only more war. And just because I thought this was interesting, this is in occupied Crimea. A mass death of dolphins caused by the Russian military presence has been recorded. Now, they've had oil leaks that have impacted this area, high-power acoustic signals during exercises, and the use of military equipment, and traps and nets installed illegally in the sea. These things disorient the dolphins, causing them to run ashore and die. Moving on to the international front for a little bit here. I already mentioned the oil dropping like a rock. And with this drop, it means that the Russians are having more trouble getting their finances together. Europe, for their part, is seeing the United States as an unreliable partner or ally, and they are starting to find ways to take the U.S. out of all of their systems. In this case, they're already talking about their digital payments being done under a system that is entirely under European control, rather than going through Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, Alipay, ones that are held by other people. They are divesting themselves of the United States. That said, in the United States, there was a large demonstration in solidarity with Ukraine in Washington. And this is a pretty good size demonstration, as you can see. A lot of people there that are there to support Ukraine. And while this is probably eyeball estimating that as a couple of hundred, probably somebody else can estimate this better, it is still U.S. citizens taking time out of their days to come and say they stand with Ukraine. Over in the UK, they have been finding Russian-built sensors that are being around the military bases in the UK. This is the Russians have been spying on the Brits for a long time, and the Brits are kind of a wild card over there in Europe at this point. So they definitely want to keep an eye on them. Of course, I expect that. I mean, spying on your enemy seems to be par for the course. Norway is allocating an additional 5 billion kroner for artillery ammunition for Ukraine. Awesome. For the first time ever, a component from India was found in Russian weapons. It was a timing buffer produced by Aura Semiconductor. This is unusual, though the small quantity, as in just one noted example, probably indicates this is done with the ignorance of the Indian government, or at least the unofficial looking the other way. If we see more Indian components showing up in bulk in other systems and other types, we may have more conversations about this. Now let's talk about the minerals deal. And if you looked at the last version of the minerals deal, it was basically tantamount to America absolutely looting Ukraine for everything it's worth. The minerals deal has changed types, formats, multiple times, everything from a kind of a partnership all the way to basically taking all of Ukraine's candy money, beating them up and stealing their lunch money. Ukraine sending another team to Washington for a new set of talks on a minerals deal. Now, Ukraine's already inked a minerals deal with, I think it's the UK at this point in time, but it's a smaller scale one. It's not like the size and scope of one that the U.S. would have. This is after a leaked draft, which was, as I mentioned, was basically looting the country, was put out on the internet. Aren't is correct English. I don't know. I don't know what you're talking about there, Al. But anyway, continuing on. So this is basically what we're looking at. If Ukraine and the U.S. can ink a just and fair minerals deal, this could be tremendous for the rebuilding of Ukraine. It puts a lasting U.S. interest in Ukraine to basically give them a reason to want to defend them. We'll see. The Europeans have tried to put together a system called Eutelsat that is hoping to replace Starlink, but at this point in time, they do not have enough coverage to fully replace it, so the Ukraine remains reliant on Starlink. Now, with all this talk of trying to ease sanctions on Russia so that they'll come for a peace deal, the European Union is standing firm and stating, no, there are no talks about easing sanctions on Russia at this point in time. They want this to remain there as a pressure tool in negotiations. But the truth is that the Trump administration is basically admitting that there's not going to be a peace deal anytime soon. And that's because while they had a full-on, complete peace deal with Ukraine, Russia has basically said, nope, not interested. And they've made that pretty clear. The Pope has actually, the Pope's envoy, I should say, delivered 4 fully equipped ambulances to Ukraine as humanitarian aid. This is this envoy's 10th mission over there to provide this type of assistance. So he's continuing to come back. It's good to see. Al says, if anything, there should be more sanctions. Sanction the heck out of them. Yeah, absolutely. That's about the only way we're going to be able to do something with that. Now let's talk about the U.S. mood about Ukraine. For a while, there was actually a larger contingent of American citizens who were against providing anything to Ukraine at all, or reducing our commitment over there. Those numbers have recovered. This poll here is actually a little bit lower than the ones I've seen elsewhere, but it's a reasonable representation here. As of April 1st, compared to January 14th, you can kind of see the numbers side by side here. On January 14th, 46% were in favor or somewhat in favor of providing additional aid to Ukraine, with 49% opposed. On April 1st, those numbers almost reversed, 49% in favor, 44% opposed. They did not have this question about who do they blame most for the war in Ukraine on the January one, but it still remains a robust 68%. More fallout from the continuing, the U.S. administration against the world here. Saab is in talks with Canada and Portugal over potentially selling them the Gripen, which is an excellent 4th generation fighter. No question about that. But it is not a 5th generation stealth fighter. Still, they're in talks with Canada and Portugal over potentially selling them the Gripen instead of the F-35. We'll have to see what happens there. All right, let's move on to the front lines, and then we'll be kind of running out of things to talk about tonight. Thank goodness. This is going to be, it's still long, but not as long as some of the time. Here is a Ukrainian MiG-29 dropping guided bombs on a Russian headquarters in Tyotkino, Kursk region. Now, real fast, kind of a high level about what's going on in Kursk. My latest understanding is that the Ukrainians are all holding on to one small village in the Kursk region and some uninhabited areas. They still maintain that presence. So that's the situation in Kursk as of my knowledge at this point in time. Still, the fact is that they're using their aviation components to actually strike into Kursk region and continue the operations in that area. Here's a Ukrainian 39th Tactical Aviation Brigade downing a Russian Shahed drone using Soviet-era 57mm S-60 anti-aircraft guns. You know, this is this is old school. This is how air defense used to be done. And when you've got slow-moving drones like this, they're susceptible to old school air defense systems. The Trump deal about with a ceasefire in the Black Sea Basin went, head belly up on Sunday, with Russia launching salvos of cruise missiles into Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities from the Black Sea. We'll have to see what happens there. Now, this is from the Institute for the Study of War. I've got about 3 versions of this, so I'm going to quickly touch on these. Russian advances in Ukraine have been steadily slowing since November of 2024. This is confirmed by the Ministry of Defense of the UK. Russian territorial gains in Ukraine have decreased during the first quarter of 2025, with Russian forces highly likely seizing only 143 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory in March 2025, an average of less than 5 square kilometers per day. Russia's rate of advance has dropped month by month since November 2024, when its forces seized more than 700 square kilometers. Most of the advances by Russian forces in March were in central Donetsk Oblast, but Russia did not improve its operational position. Ukrainian forces also carried out tactical counterattacks, reversing some of Russia's great gains around Pokrovsk. The level of Russian ground attacks on several axes was reduced through much of March 2025. These began to increase towards the end of the month, but have not resulted in a higher rate of advance. Or, here's the graph for you. The Institute for the Study of Wars analysis is this blue line. The red line is the British Ministry of Defense. Either way, the trend line is obvious. A downward trend in the amount of territory that the Russians have gained. Let's see. Al states, still a lot of countries use the old 40mm Bofors. If your crew is switched on, old stuff can still work. Absolutely correct. By the way, while we're in the Institute for the Study of War, they talked about the rate of advances declining. They also talked about Russian forces conducting the largest series of missile and drone strikes against Ukraine in nearly a month on the night of April 5th and 6th. Ukrainian officials also highlighted that the Russians are leveraging their naval vessels in the Black Sea to conduct missile strikes against Ukraine, as Russia continues to stall the Black Sea moratorium on military operations that Ukraine and the United States have jointly proposed, which tells you how serious the Kremlin is about their peace talks. The Kremlin is attempting to portray Ukraine as consistently violating the proposed temporary ceasefire on strikes against energy infrastructure, though without providing evidence, in stark contrast to the pattern of Russian reporting about successful Ukrainian strikes against Russian energy infrastructure prior to the ceasefire proposal. Basically, Russia's saying, Ukraine is violating the ceasefire. But right up until the ceasefire, they posted pictures and video of repeated strikes on Russian oil infrastructure. Since then, they've had nothing to show for proof. Here's the deep state map. This is from today here. The Ukrainians managed to advance in Shevchenko. There we go, Shevchenko. To give you some context here, this is outside of Pokrovsk. So let's go ahead and zoom in here. And you can kind of see here when we go back a day. Just that little chunk right there, right on the Enko in Shevchenko. Whereas the Russians advanced near Huyevo, which bear with me on those pronunciations. You can see that, generally speaking, the Ukrainians have a small sliver of land here with no major towns or villages in it, except for, like I said, one that they're still holding on to in Kursk. The Russians also gained some territory in Novolyubivka. Oof. Let's see what that looks like there. Mostly looks like tree lines from the looks of things. And in Chasiv Yar, the Russians have been getting well into the city itself over the last several weeks. They took another little chunk there, little teeny tiny chunk. For reference, let's see if I can even find it on the map at this point. The deep state map has not talked about the Ukrainian incursion into Belgorod, except for this little gray zone right here. So there is still indication that this is going on. I don't have good information on it. I just really don't have good updates on it. Russian telegram channels, however, are saying that the Ukrainians are advancing in the Belgorod region. Let's go ahead and read that one here. Popovka district, Belgorod Oblast, temporarily occupied territory of Russia by Ukraine. This morning, southwest of the settlement, the armed forces of Ukraine, wearing identification markers in the form of white armbands, launched an assault on the positions of the 34th Brigade. The latter retreated, surrendering their positions to the enemy to a depth of 600 meters. At the moment, the 155th Separate Guards Naval Infantry Brigade is conducting an assault and clearing the occupied positions. The enemy's opportunities for evacuation or reinforcement with reserves have also been blocked. Now, just so we're clear, I take everything I read from Russian sources with a grain of salt, and often Ukrainian sources as well, but this is the advance they're talking about right here. This also talks about the Kursk region here, saying it's clear that Ukraine has pulled back primarily, with only one tiny hamlet remaining under Ukrainian control, Oleshnaya. South of Pokrovsk, Russians were geolocated in the northeastern part of Shevchenko, reversing gains made by the Ukrainians in recent weeks. No report states it is a back and forth, with neither party establishing a permanent foothold in the village. And the Ukraine control map just kind of notes that the Ukraine's defense continues with only marginal Russian gains marked, with the map focused on Velika Novosilka, where Ukraine's slowly losing ground along the river, with not much to stop their progress. This was an area that there was a lot of Ukrainian progress through this area at the height of the summer offensive last year, as I recall. It was interesting, but not particularly tactical. So, or at least strategic level. So we'll just have to keep an eye on this area. The War Gonzo basically confirms everything I just mentioned here, though they do state that the lines of control in Belgorod have been changing rapidly, and consider everything in a gray zone. So take that as you will. Russians, for their part, have started up the blocking units again, with Russian commanders overheard ordering troops to open fire on their comrades in another unit, with intercepted calls showing the Russian commander losing his temper and ordering his soldiers to shoot at their own comrades in a neighboring unit. And that's kind of everything here. Al, do we have any idea on what Russia's missile stockpile is looking like? With these renewed strikes, I'm wondering where they keep pulling these missiles from. The truth is that Russia maintains a certain amount of constant production. What they especially Shahed drones, they've actually got three manufacturing facilities for Shahed drones, as I understand it at this point. They have really the bulk of their strikes at this point are Shahed drones. That said, they do maintain small volume production of Kinzhal and other actual significant military hardware. Not that Shaheds are not significant, but the big stuff, So they will never technically run out, much like they'll never technically run out of tanks, because they are producing small amounts of tanks. But what that status is, we'll have to see if we can find out some more information. They did have a huge stockpile of missiles and things, actually aircraft armaments, effectively, that were destroyed a few weeks ago. So there was, at least from that perspective, airdrop munitions dropped for a while at that point. I've not seen whether that is recovered fully yet or not. Hope that answers your question as best as I can, at least off the cuff here. So all good, all good. Do want to just say thank you again for joining me tonight. And more than anything else, I am thankful that you are all willing to support both me and support Ukraine. I'm not saying that supporting me is supporting Ukraine per se, but I know that every single one here has done things in support of Ukraine, whether that's talking to people, whether that's posting about it, whether that's just being willing to say, hey, Ukraine deserves to be defended. Thank you. Thank you, all of you. And on that note, once again, you guys have a great rest of your night, and we'll see you on the next video.